Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today I'd like to chat to you about 17 different cabled knitting patterns, including some yarn and color inspiration. If you're new here, my name is Anne-Sophie. I'm a knitter from Belgium, and I've been knitting for about 3 years now, I think. I'm doing a PhD in linguistics, and in my free time I like to dance, but also and mostly knit. I usually knit mostly stockinette projects, but I dabble in a textured knit from time to time, and as is the case for most people, and probably also for you if you clicked on this video, I'm quite obsessed with the look of a cabled. And since it's fall and cables seem to be especially trendy, I thought, why not film a little roundup of all of the cabled patterns that I have saved on Ravelry or Instagram. I have 17 patterns that I'd like to talk through. For me, this is going to be a really good exercise to see which of these patterns excite me the most. I'm a very enthusiastic person. I love novelty, I crave novelty, and I really enjoy choosing patterns and choosing yarns and colors to use for them. But of course, there's only so much time to actually be knitting up those patterns, especially cabled ones. And I thought maybe it would be a nice idea to sort of satisfy my need to be knitting all of these different cabled projects by just talking about them with you guys and maybe inspiring one of you. And I think it would be cool to kind of talk through what yarn these patterns suggest and whether I would be using this yarn or not and why, and also take a look at the different color options. I don't know, I think it's fun to try and figure out what color I would like to knit patterns in, so I think I'm just going to do that for this video. In total, I have about 8 sweaters, 3 cardigans, 2 summer tops or summer vests, and 4 home accessories. I'll start by going over the sweaters and the cardigans, then go into tops, and then into home accessories. I will be timestamping the video, so if any of these categories interest you more, you want to jump ahead and look at them already, you can easily do so. And I will also be including links in my description box below, as well as a Ravelry bundle. So the first sweater I am absolutely obsessed with, and have been ever since I saw it for the first time, and that is the Heart Chain Sweater by From Mayo. This sweater is a scrumptious, very chunky, all over variegated cabled sweater. It sports 2x2 rib on the crew neck collar and the hems, and it is a very chunky, oversized drop shoulder. It gets its name from the heart-shaped chained cables on the side, which I absolutely love the look of. I think it's just so cute and pretty, and at the same time it's like balanced out beautifully by this very big diamond cable going through the middle with pearl bumps or non-stockinette stitch in every other diamond, I think. It looks like something that knits up relatively quickly for a cabled knit because it's quite chunky, but also remains interesting while you're knitting it up because it has so many different cables going on at the same time. And also just like this kind of sweater that if you end up wearing this outside and you tell people that you've knit it yourself, you're going to be met with this glorious look of absolute shock, which I tend to relish in sometimes. It's one of the best feelings ever. When you go out and you wear a sweater and someone compliments you on it and you get to say, "Oh, thanks, I made this myself," and you see the absolute utter disbelief on their faces, there's nothing that gives me more joy than that. I mean, my cat, maybe, or buying yarn. I guess it's a solid third. So some specs on this pattern. It is constructed top down. It's a drop shoulder, so I bet you knit the back panel first and then pick up stitches for the left and right front, cast on for the collar, and then knit down until you can connect in the round at the underarms. It has the chunky 2x2 rib that I mentioned earlier. It calls for a worsted weight held with a lace weight yarn, and it's suggested to be knit up on 5.5mm needles. The gauge for the pattern is 18 stitches by 23 rows in stockinette, or 38 stitches by 27 rows in cable pattern. The sizes range from a small to a 2XL, and I think the FO will measure between 104 and 128 centimeters with those sizes. The pattern comes in English and Korean. If my notes don't mention a suggested yarn for a pattern, it's either because there's no suggested yarn, or it's a very obscure one, or the designer suggests multiple different types of yarn. I don't have any included in my notes for this one, but I have noted down that I think I would love to knit this up in Knitting for Olive Heavy Merino held with Knitting for Olive Soft Silk Mohair. This yarn is quite expensive and quite luxurious, but I think for me it would make sense to use it for such a glorious, marvelous cabled pattern. I don't think I'll be knitting many complicated, gorgeous patterns like that in my lifetime, so I think when I do, it's warranted for me to be using a fancy yarn like Knitting for Olive yarn. And what I like about Knitting for Olive as well is that they have just an abundance of color choices. Their yarn isn't only amazing, they just also give you all of these different choices of colors. While that usually gives me terrible choice paralysis, I think now for this one, it's not so hard to me to figure out what kind of color I would knit it in. I think I'd either go with a classic creamy color. I would select the color Cloud from Knitting for Olive, which is a white but with like a pinkish undertone, or maybe a dusty petroleum blue, because I don't know, the dusty petroleum blue to me would function as like a very muted neutral that works with a lot of different bottoms and jeans even. I think it would give you the effect of a darker cabled knit in like an anthracite or a dark gray, while still maintaining some of the vibrancy of the blue. Like dark enough to be a dark neutral, but light enough for a cabled pattern to really shine, and for something to be easy to knit on in the dark as well. I do think, however, when I do end up knitting this sweater, I'd probably want to go for like a dusty pink, which unfortunately Knitting for Olive doesn't have. So I've been looking into what other yarns I could use, and my second favorite worsted weight yarn is Filcolana Peruvian Highland Wool, which also comes in a lot of colors and can be held with their Tilia mohair. I think the dusty pink I would choose from there would be the old or vintage rose held with the tilia in purple. I'm not sure how warm those pinks are. I think I can get away with the relatively warm pink, but I'd have to go check them out in store to see which ones match well. I've checked out some Ravelry projects which use this yarn color and they look stunning. So I think when I do end up knitting this, I'll probably end up going for the Filcolana Peruvian and a purplish pinkish hue, because I've kind of been thinking that this would be adorable to knit in January and February to be able to wear for Valentine's. To be very honest with you, I've been obsessed with dusty pinks lately, but Valentine's and February just call for that kind of color to me. If anyone else is interested in knitting up this sweater around that time, feel free to let me know and reach out, because I've never done that before, but maybe I could try and set up a little cal and a little group chat. If you'd be up for that or if you'd be interested, let me know and I'll see what I can do this winter. Yeah, I think out of everything on this list, this is one of the cabled knits I will be casting on within a year, most definitely. The next pattern I want to talk about is a pattern by Hanna maciejewska. I'm not sure whether I pronounced that correctly. I think it's a Polish name. And that is a TESSA sweater. The TESSA sweater is a top-down turtleneck drop-shoulder sweater featuring all over undulating cables. It's a very minimalist, clean sweater. The sleeves are slightly fitted, and on the Ravelry pattern page, it says that they're knit with German short rows. I'm a bit on edge about the fitted sleeves. I don't generally like the look of a fitted sleeve, especially with a wider sweater. So I think I would be modifying that sweater should I knit it to knit wider, almost flaring out sleeves with it. Although I'm not sure what I'd have to do with the short rows in that case. I don't have much experience knitting short rows for sleeves. Maybe I could leave them out. I'm not sure. I would have to buy the pattern to really know for sure how I could make that work. The pattern calls for a worsted weight yarn, and it suggests the Quince & Co. Owl. The Quince & Co. Owl gives you 110 meters per 50 grams, and it is a 50% wool and 50% alpaca blend. I don't have easy access to the Quince & Co. yarns here in Europe, so I've been looking into what kind of yarn I could substitute this with. I ended up with one of my favorite worsted weight yarns to use again, and that is the Filcolana Peruvian. It is a 100% worsted weight wool. The lack of alpaca, I wouldn't mind it because alpaca gets to be very drapey, but I wouldn't mind the sweater being a tiny bit less drapey for me than it is on the sample pictures. The Peruvian gives you 10 meters less than the suggested yarn does. It gives you 100 meters per 50 grams, so I think it would be quite an alright match. And again, it comes in so many gorgeous, gorgeous colors. I think for this pattern, I would use, again, the old rose because I've just been obsessed with that color, but if I'm not thinking about the old rose, I think I would go for like a cool brown neutral. Bark would look really, really, really good. So I think that's what I'll end up settling for if I knit this in the future. The suggested needle size for this pattern is 4.5mm needles. And with those for the pattern, you should hit a gauge of around 20 stitches by 26 rows. The pattern comes in 9 different sizes, ranging from a 99.5 to 171 finished bust circumference on the project. The pattern comes in English. The third sweater I'd like to chat to you about is the FRIDAGSGENSER by aftenstrikk. Also an incredibly chunky, variegated, very cozy autumnal sweater. To me, the sweater just screams drinking hot cocoa while sitting on a cozy chair with a blanket right next to your Christmas tree and reading a book. It looks like it's a lot of fun to knit because there's not as many cables on the sleeves as there are on the body, and the cables are really big, which makes it look quite feasible and makes me think it'll probably be less hard on your hands than many of the other cabled knitting patterns that I've looked at before. It is a bottom-up drop shoulder. Again, I'm sensing a theme with a turtleneck, but of course turtlenecks can easily be switched out for a crew neck with ribbing. It features moss stitch and chunky cables and calls for an Aran weight yarn. The suggested needle size for this pattern is 5mm needles, and with those you are expected to hit a gauge of around 16 stitches. The finished objects range from 83 to 158 centimeters, and the pattern comes in English, Danish, and Norwegian. The suggested yarn for this pattern is Rauma Vamsegarn, which unfortunately is discontinued, I've learned. The Vamsegarn was a 100% wool yarn and gave you 83 meters per 50 grams. I think you could get away by substituting it for a Rauma Fivel, but you might need to hold a lace weight with that to hit gauge depending on how tightly or loosely you knit. I think I wouldn't mind a less bulky version, so I think I would use Rauma Fivel, and if I end up being off gauge, I'll just size up or size down if I like the fabric. The Fivel is also 100% Norwegian wool, and it comes in 100 meters per 50 grams, and then just a ton of gorgeous colors as well. The colors in Raumafivel are a bit more vibrant than I'm used to, but I think my pick would be, again, for a very simple creamy gray color, like a putty almost, or maybe also a dark blue. Those colors suit complicated cabled sweaters just incredibly well, and if something works, why mess with it? The colors in Raumafivel that I would use specifically are 29 and 4078. And yeah, I really like that pattern. I hope I ever get to knitting this up because I can really imagine myself during like Christmas time reading and just cozying up in this chunky, gorgeous FRIDAGSGENSER. The fourth sweater I'd like to chat to you about is the PACHIRA sweater by twinknits. This is a bit of a less chunky sweater than the other ones, but again, a drop shoulder crew neck all over cabled sweater. It has a very interesting construction that has intrigued me ever since I clicked on this pattern page on Ravelry. So it's knit top down, but you use Judy's Magic cast on to cast on stitches. Initially you work it flat and with short rows, starting at the Judy's cast on. I think you start with the back and then you go and pick up those provisionally cast on stitches to continue working on the front, which I've never done before. I've never heard about anyone doing before, and I'd be curious to see what that does to the structure and the fit and the look of a sweater. It seems like you'll almost get a seamless continuation of the cables, where otherwise you would have a drop shoulder line that kind of cuts through the cables and breaks up the look and the construction of the knit a little bit. I'm wondering how structurally sound this knit would be though, especially because it's knit up with a DK weight. I don't know, it intrigues me. If any of you have experience with this sweater and would like to tell me a bit more about your experience and how it wears in the comments down below, please feel free to do so. I'd love to know. The pattern suggests several different yarns to hold a lace weight with a DK and get a DK weight gauge. With this DK weight yarn, you would use 4.5mm needles to knit it up at a gauge of 20 stitches by 24 rows. The sizes range from a size small to a size 3XL, and the pattern comes in English and Danish. Since the pattern suggests several yarns, I think I'd go for a Peer Gynt by Sandnesgarn, which is a rustic 100% Norwegian wool DK, and people have said that this hardly ever pills, it holds really nicely. I think that yarn choice would make sense for me to kind of ease any worries about how the garment would hold up with the provisional cast on and the lack of seams, essentially, to give it some structure. There's a lot of yarn in cables and a lot of weight goes into cables, so I think I'd be scared that my garment would end up sagging, and I feel like the Peer Gynt would kind of help me feel more secure in my garment holding up nicely over time. I've been obsessed with the new Petite Knit Peer Gynt colors, and especially 6050 Above the Clouds, and I think this sweater would look really fun in like that pretty cute light blue, but I also think it would look really nice in like a grayed out forest green. It would give like the look of a classic grandpa sweater, but with this pattern I think it would be elegant at the same time and just work for so many different clothing styles or occasions. So I think I'd go for the Urban Chic 9080 colorway. I do also really like the kit color in Sandnesgarn Peer Gynt, but I feel like a white cabled sweater is just a bit bland, you know? It's just the classic, and I'm a bit scared to knit a white cabled sweater because, I mean, how many white cabled sweaters do you want in your wardrobe? I think when I knit a white cabled sweater or a cream colored or putty colored cabled sweater, it has to be the perfect one so that I can knit other cabled sweaters or cabled garments in more fun colors. I do think the heart chain sweater is one that I would dare to knit up in a creamy color, but for this one I'd go for something more fun personally. The next sweater I'd like to talk to you about is the Minto sweater by Knitonomy or Magdalena Parker, which is again a drop shoulder crew neck all over cabled sweater. What's interesting is that this pattern comes in a chunkier version and a lighter version, and honestly I don't know which I like best. The suggested yarn is a worsted for the heavyweight version, and for the lighter weight I think either a sport or a DK. Personally I think I'd go for Sunless Garn Double Sunday and knit it up with a DK and not like a fingering held with a mohair or anything, what I think the sample might be knit up in. The needle size mentioned on Ravelry is 5.5 millimeter needles, although I do assume that that is probably for the chunkier version, and the gauge you're supposed to hit is 19 by 24 stitches. I don't exactly know how these needle sizes and gauge work with the sizes and the weights of the sweater, because you have the chunky and the light version, and for the chunky and the light version you each have 3 sizes as well. So you have capital A, capital B, capital C size, or lowercase a, lowercase b, and lowercase c size. The chunky version sizes measure 118, 150, and 185 centimeters for the finished objects, and the lighter version measures 100, 130, and 165 centimeters for the finished objects. It seems like the lighter version is almost 20 centimeters less oversized than the chunky version, which may also be interesting to know. This pattern comes in English, Danish, Finnish, German, and Norwegian. With this gorgeous, almost flower-like cable, I think this sweater would warrant a cream-colored yarn. I dare say I'd go for the Sunless Garn Double Sunday in the color Kit, although a dusty aqua bluish color would look scrumptious as well. For that, I think I'd go with the 6051 colorway of the Double Sunday. I'd have to buy the pattern and read more into the light or the chunky version to figure out which one I'd like to knit, but I think for me the yarn choice would make a huge difference as well. But definitely I could use the Double Sunday or the Sunday held with or without a mohair, depending on what size and what weight I want to knit. Now the next sweater I'd like to talk to you about is the What a Catch sweater by Dagmar, and this is not a drop shoulder crew neck oversized cabled sweater. This is actually a mock neck fitted, very elegant, very mindful, very demure sweater pattern featuring I think a circular yoke and these all over lattice cables that just spread out over the yoke, which looks so elegant and so pretty. It has a relatively fitted sleeve and 1x1 rib, and on the pattern page it says that the all over lattice cable gives you invisible increases or allows for invisible increases. I assume this means it's a circular yoke, but yeah, I'd have to buy the pattern to find that out. Since it's a tight fitting pattern, I always check whether it includes short rows for a nice fit, and it does, which we commend on this channel. The pattern suggests you hold a fingering with a lace weight on 4 or 4.5 millimeter needles. The needle size depends on your size and the gauge. Depending on your size, you should hit a gauge of either 22 stitches by 32 rows or 24 stitches by 30. Hi, Lila! or 24 stitches by 36 rows. The sizes range from an extra small to a 2XL, and the finished object will measure somewhere between 80 and 127 centimeters. Pattern comes in English and Danish. The recommended yarn is my favorite yarn combination in the whole wide world, which is Knitting for Olive Merino, held with Knitting for Olive Soft Silk Mohair. Revolutionary, shocking, I know, everybody loves this yarn, but with good reason, and the color choices on this one are just unmatched. I would love to see this more feminine pattern in like a dusty violet or a dusty rose, or maybe even like like a purplish pink, the artichoke purple. Yeah, I think dusty violet or artichoke purple for me would be the perfect choices for this pattern. If you want, you can let me know in the comments whether you agree with my color choices and yarn choices for these patterns or not, or maybe or maybe you could even let me know which colors or yarns you would like to use for these patterns should you knit them up. If you hear some purring, that's because Lila has settled down on my lap and refuses to settle down anywhere else. And who am I to throw her out, you know? The next pattern I'd like to talk about is by Sari Nordlund. Of course, Sari Nordlund cannot not be included in a video on cables. I had trouble picking a design of hers, but I ended up going with the Colette pullover, which is just beautiful, but again, a crew neck drop shoulder pattern with all over cables. Now what makes this one really interesting is that the cables are broken up by horizontal lines with eyelets, it seems, and that just gives it more of a like vintagey interest, which I absolutely love. It calls for a fingering weight held with a lace weight, which should give you a DK gauge and a gauge of 19 by 28 by using 3.5mm needles, which is kind of small. I do think this would be a labor of love. The pattern comes in 9 sizes and the finished objects measures between 101 and 177 centimeters in those sizes. The pattern comes in English and it suggests, again, my favorite, knitting for olive, merino, and mohair. I think, for once, I would not use the knitting for olive yarn, even though it's suggested. I would go for Sunless Garn Sunday, or, well, Double Sunday would give you a DK weight without a mohair, because I don't think I'd like this pattern to be drapey and mohair fluffy for me personally. I think I'd like it to have like just some chunk to it, so I think I would use Sunless Garn's Double Sunday or Sunday held double, depending on the colors that are available. And talking about the colors, I think I would have to end up using Sunday held double because I would love to use the 4632 pink color, especially for this sweater. I've seen many Ingrid sweaters in pink, and with the horizontal sections, this pattern kind of gives off a similar vibe, and I think it would look amazing and like so cute on jeans or over a skirt. That would be my plan for this sweater. Now the last sweater I'd like to talk to you about is a bit of an obscure one, and that is the Twisted Cables sweater by Marianne Isager. I couldn't find much information on it on the internet, and it looks very, very similar to the earlier pattern we saw with the undulating cables, the Tessa sweater. It looks like a drop shoulder with undulating cables all over, and it has a very thick crew neck, but it looks a bit more sporty and a bit more unisex than the Tessa sweater does. And to be honest, I've just been obsessed with it ever since I came across it on Ravelry when browsing Marianne Isager's patterns. It calls for a DK weight held with a light fingering, arguably I'd say a lace because you're supposed to end up with a DK, and they suggest to hold Isager Alpaca 1 with Isager Jensen. On 4.5mm needles, you should get a gauge of 20 stitches by 26 rows, and the sizes range from a size 1 to 5. I couldn't immediately find more information on the sizes, and something tricky here is that the pattern comes in German and Japanese. Those are the languages you can buy it in on Ravelry. It also exists in English and Danish, but you can't buy those versions of the pattern on Ravelry. You would need to buy a pattern book, which, depending on the other patterns in that knitting book, I actually might end up getting that book at one point, and otherwise I'll just try and figure it out from the German pattern, since I know quite some German and one of my best friends is German, so she could help me figure it out, and otherwise ChatGPT is also there, so I think I should be able to knit this pattern with the German, but I don't know. I love the look of this knit so much that I really felt like including it anyway. I think in terms of yarn, I would use the suggested yarn, which is a lace weight alpaca, so you get 400 meters per 50 grams for that generally, and the Jensen gives you 125 meters per 50 grams. So that's like an alpaca and the Jensen is a merino. I think that would give a lovely fabric. And the colors in the sample are 6S in the Jensen yarn and E2S in the alpaca one, and it just looks like a perfect gehrisch to me. And I don't know, I think I might have just been looking at this pattern too much for my own good because I almost can't imagine it in a different color anymore. So I think personally I would just end up using the exact colors used in the sample. However, I do think the 12 colors of isager, which are like a lavendery purplish gray color, would also look really good with these cables, and like make sure the garment remains to be like classic and a neutral, but also give it like something fun with the purple. I love a good purple. It's time to get into the cardigans. The first cardigan on my list is the Auguste cardigan by Kolibri by Johanna, who I think is a German knitwear designer. And I've talked about this pattern in my fall knitting plans as well, but I just adore the way this looks. It's actually not a drop shoulder for once, it's a raglan, and I believe the raglan goes along the cable stitches. I love the look of that. The cable pattern is an alternating stockinette patch with a cable, which I think looks really neat and is also just nice. You'd have to do like half as much cabling as you would need to do if the pattern had all over cables. The button band on this cardigan is, for as far as I know, I don't think it's double knitting. I think it's actually ribbing that you knit while you knit the rest of the garment, which sign me up for that. I love a good double knit looking, because it looks like DK, the double knit button band, but it's knit in ribbing, so it's like a bit less work than adding on a double knit button band because you have to pick up all the stitches around like the whole garment. I prefer the look of a double knitted button band over like a ribbed button band, but this is just, it seems to be the perfect in-between situation, and I can't wait to try it out sometime and to knit up this pattern. The yarn weight is a lace weight held with a DK weight to give you a DK, and the suggested needle size for that is 4.5 millimeter needles to hit a gauge of 22 stitches by 30 rows. The sizes this pattern comes in range from an extra small to a 2XL, and the pattern is available in English, Dutch, French, German, and Italian. The suggested yarn is actually Filcolana Pernilla and Tilia, and in my fall knitting plans I talked about how I wanted to knit this pattern in like mayo yarn, but I have since changed my mind a bit. I think I would actually frog the Ingrid sweater that I've been knitting up. I think I've gotten as far as like the yoke. I think I just joined for the underarms on my Ingrid sweater whip, and I've been knitting that up in Filcolana, Pernilla, and Tilia, but I haven't been liking the look because it's like not dense enough to me. The ribbing looks a bit wonky. The cables look fine, but the ribbed sections just don't look good to me, and it's been frustrating me, and I don't think the sweater is going to fall as I would like it to on my body. I don't enjoy the fabric for that pattern, so I think I'll end up frogging that because it's been laying around for like a year and a half at this point, or maybe even 2 years. So I think I would frog that and end up using that yarn for this one, and the color I have would work perfectly, I think, because the color is also one of the problems I have with that whip. I bought the Pernilla in the color Marzipan and the Tilia in the color Latte because they don't have a mohair that matches their Marzipan colorways, and the closest thing are either a cream or a white, or the Latte, which is like a very warm beige. So I thought it would be fine to use the warm beige after looking at like Ravelry project photos. Like in some types of light it looks like a full-on marzipan knit and it looks amazing, but in others it kind of looks just too warm and too beige for me, which I think especially for like the Ingrid sweater, which is a funnel neck or a crew neck, I'm not excited to be wearing that color. Whereas with the V-neck cabled cardigan, I think I wouldn't need to like find a way to use the mohair or sell the mohair. I think I would actually be able to use it for myself and actually like wearing it because it would be like lower down on my body and a nice neutral. So I might actually end up using that yarn for this in the future. Yeah, that's that for the Auguste cardigan. The second cardigan I'd like to talk to you about is quite similar in style to the heart chain sweater because it is also I think Japanese or Korean designer, and Japanese Korean clothing styles and knitting patterns are they have been trendy for a while, and rightfully so. They look amazing, and this one is no exception. It is a crew neck cardigan, which usually isn't my style, but because it is like sufficiently chunky and big and would actually function as a jacket for that reason, I think for me it would be like the only case where I would feel like a crew neck cardigan would work for me instead of a v-neck cardigan, because I don't necessarily like the look of a crew neck cardigan if it's not like fitted, and a cardigan that has like buttons just for show, like you're always going to keep them buttoned up or something. I think another exception would be the fennel seed jacket by Handmade by Florence. I think that's also a crew neck, but again, it's called a jacket, so it's like it's a cardigan, but it's sufficiently chunky and heavy, I guess, to look nice, and it's like cropped and everything compared to some other cardigans, so I think it would look really good. It has these very chunky zigzag cables on both sides of the front and at like the sleeves, but these are alternated with more delicate, like almost herringbone cables, it seems, and that just looks so sweet to me, and that balance makes my mouth water, honestly, in terms of wanting to knit this. Like whenever I see pictures of the baguette cardigan, but also the baguette sweater, there's a sweater version too, I need to stop myself from going online and immediately buying yarn to knit this. The suggested yarn weight is lace weight plus bulky, so I think it would be like a relatively quick cabled knit too, which we love around here. It's knit up on a 4.5mm needles at an 18 stitch 27 row gauge in moss stitch, and it comes in 4 sizes. There's actually like a classic Korean size chart. Like if you've ever shopped online on Korean clothing stores, you will have noticed that most of those garments come with these charts where they include different measurements like the length, the sleeve width, the width of the garment, and I think that should just be the standard in fashion across the board because that's such a good practice. And I think here this designer applied it for their design as well, which is just wonderful. I'm just looking at the picture here, you get 4 measurements for all 4 sizes. The first measurement is of course the width of the garment, then there's the length of the garment, there's the circumference of the sleeve, and then there's the length of the sleeve starting at the drop shoulder. I think that gives you so much valuable information, and if I ever end up designing my own garments, I know I'm just gonna have to do that too because it's so valuable, and I don't understand why not everyone is doing this because it's too good. The suggested yarn is La Manna Premia and Como Grande, which are yarns I've been avoiding learning more about because they're quite fancy. They're a 60-40 mohair silk blend and 100% superwash merino, and the mohair gives you 300 meters per 25 grams, which is a very thin mohair, while the merino gives you 120 meters per 50 grams. The pattern says bulky, but I've talked about worsted weight yarns in this video that give you 100 meters per 50 grams, so I'm kind of like on the fence of what kind of yarn you should be using with this to hit gauge. I'm not really sure. I think personally I would go for Sunless Garn Fritidsgarn, which is a true bulky yarn and which would work I think really well for like a cozy warm jacket, like something to wear outside when it's like cold enough to wear a very heavy cardigan but not so cold that you need a full-on wool coat, if you know what I mean. I think Fritidsgarn would just function very well as a yarn for that. That is a 100% Norwegian wool that gives you 70 meters per 50 grams. If I would be off gauge with this, I don't think I'd mind because these kinds of garments, and especially these jackets, I don't know how important gauge is there for me personally or how closely I want to meet the measurements of the samples or suggested in the pattern, because it's just supposed to be a big chunky knit, right? And especially cardigans are very easy to try on as you go, so I think I would quite easily be able to finesse that if I make a big proper gauge swatch. I don't know. What I do know is that I would use the cool brown color of the Fritidsgarn, the 3880. I feel a need for a brown jacket in my wardrobe, and I think this pattern and that yarn at this point are the #1 contender for me, right now at least. The third and last cabled cardigan I'd like to chat to you guys about today is the Johanna flettejakke by Rauma. I'm never sure whether I pronounce these Norwegian or Danish things correctly, or even Swedish for that matter, but I'm trying. But so flettejakke essentially means cabled cardigan or cabled jacket, which it is. It's an all-over cabled traditional jacket cardigan. It looks scrumptious, and what sells me on wanting to knit this are the huge chunks of what seems to be moss stitch along the back and the front. I think there would be sufficient cabling to keep you engaged, but you would manage to get through a round relatively quickly because there's a lot of just easy stitches to do in between cables, which doesn't only sound like nice and agreeable to be doing just project-wise, but in terms of the finished look, I also really like how that looks. It is again a drop shoulder cabled pattern though, but this cardigan does have a V-neck, and the button band is a very chunky double knitted one, or so it seems to me at least. The suggested yarn weight is a DK weight, and they suggest you to use Rauma Fivel, which I talked about earlier, which gives you 100 meters per 50 grams. It is 100% Norwegian wool. I think I would use that suggested yarn because it seems like a very durable and proper choice for such a garment. You knit it up on 4.5mm needles at a 22 stitch gauge, and the sizes you can pick from range from an extra small to a 3XL. Now, the pattern does only come in Norwegian. I don't think I've ever really talked about this before on my channel, but I studied English and Swedish, linguistics and literature at university, so I speak some Swedish, I understand Swedish very well, and by extension, I can also understand especially written Norwegian and Danish, and I took a Norwegian course one semester, which we didn't learn all too much Norwegian in there, but I do think my level of understanding of the Norwegian language is sufficiently high for me to be able to knit a garment with a Norwegian pattern. If there's any terms that I don't know, the internet will easily be able to help me out, and otherwise I might know sufficient Norwegian people who know how to knit that can help me out if I do end up struggling. So personally, I think I should be able to knit this up. I've heard a lot of people who have been able to knit garments from patterns that are like in Norwegian or in German, even though they don't speak that language at all. So I thought, why not just include this anyway? I think it's a pretty enough pattern to not be excluded from this video. And I really just wanted to share it because I think it's more of an obscure one as well. The color, I think I'd go a bit more daring with this one. I think I would knit this jacket in either like a dark forest green or a bright red. Like a bright red with a blue undertone. I would have to see this yarn in person to really figure out whether the red is not too warm for me, because I know a forest green will look good on me, but a red is always a bit risky for me. I have very soft features and I lean more cool toned, but I think a blue toned bright red in this jacket might just work. It might just look really cool. This is maybe a bit silly, but I have these red high top Converse, and I think with a pair of jeans and a simple plain tee and this red cardigan, that might just end up being one of my favorite outfits ever. Yeah, I don't know. I've just for some reason decided that I need and want this pattern in a bright red or a forest green, but in terms of tops, I have two. First of all, I'd like to cover the Phoebe top by Amy Sher Makes, which is a, I think, quite fashionable, very broad-shouldered summer top with a crew neck and all over cables, but they alternate in width. So it's the same cable, alternated in terms of width. You have wide ones, you have less wide ones, I think 2 smaller cables, and then a wider one, and then 2 smaller ones again, which looks just really cute to me. The garment to me looks really sleek while also being boxy and cropped. What I don't really like is the look of the I-cord edge on the armholes. There's a ribbed edge for the crew neck or like a ribbed neckline, but the armholes seem to be finished with I-cord edges. I would knit my version with like folded over stockinette edges or maybe double knitted ones to give it a bit more, I don't know, weight, visual weight than the I-cord does. I think it's such a nice nice boxy sleek look, and then the I-cord on the armhole for me is almost too dainty. Since it's a summer top, it is knit with a fingering weight yarn. It suggests knitting for olive pure silk, which is a 100% ethically produced silk that comes in 50-gram balls that measure 250 meters. You knit it up on 3.25 millimeter needles, which to me seems a bit large for such a light fingering weight yarn to be cabled. I'm wondering whether I'll have issues with gauge if I end up knitting this up. You're supposed to hit a 28 stitch by 32 row gauge on those 3.25 millimeter needles, and the sizes range from an A to a J, fitting upper busts ranging from 77.5 to 150.5 centimeters. The pattern comes in English. Personally, I think I try to use Sandnesgarn Tin Line, which gives you 220 meters per 50 grams. I think that might give me a bit more ease mentally with regards to hitting gauge or not, and also my wallet because it's a lot less expensive than the Knitting for Olive Pure Silk, and I feel like even though it's a completely different blend of fibers, it is quite similar in knitting experience and in how it wears, how it feels on your body, and also how it looks. So I think for me that's an ideal substitute. The blend is 53% cotton, 33% viscose, and 14% linen, and I think I would use the 1015 kit or putty colorway, or maybe, I'm not sure, the 8561 like grayed out green. I think that would look really cute as well. The second top I'd like to talk about is the Taipei vest by Mochi Knits. This is basically the chunky little sibling of the Phoebe top. The difference being that it does have chunkier armhole edges. I think it's a folded over stockinette edge. Also has a ribbed, I think twisted rib crew neck, but instead of alternating cables with different sizes, it's an alternating stockinette patch and a cable. They're thin cables, and it's a top-down construction as well. The yarn weight it calls for is a DK weight, and it suggests to use the Tex Andes Laguna Blanca. Never heard of this yarn before. It's a merino rayon flax blend, and it gives you 230 meters per 100 grams. It's supposed to be knit up on 4mm needles at a gauge of 25 stitches and 34 rows, and the sizes range from an extra small to a 3XL. Since Mochi Knits is a Spanish designer, the pattern comes in English and Spanish. Personally, I think I'd swatch out the suggested yarn for Penelope by Deririm Natura. I've really been wanting to try out that yarn brand. My local yarn store here in Ghent, Wolder, holds this yarn, and it looks beautiful, and every time I've looked at it and I've felt it, I've just felt this little spark, you know, you can get with yarn sometimes, or at least I do. And I think the Taipei vest would be a really good top or vest to try out that scrumptious yarn. It gives you 133 meters per 50 grams, and it's a 90% merino and 10% silk blend. So it's a bit of a more bougie yarn. I would for sure be off gauge with that yarn, but in my experience, I never really hit gauge for Mochi Knits patterns. I've tried several gauge swatches for her patterns before. It always ends up slightly wrong. I think I must have just completely different tension from the designer. So I don't necessarily worry about that. I think as long as I make a proper gauge swatch and make calculations and try it on sufficiently while knitting, I should manage to get a nice looking garment. So I don't think I'd worry about that. What I do worry about is my color choice, because the Penelope color I want to try out the most is the Crépuscule colorway, which is like a thunder cloudy dark blue gray, and I'm not entirely sure how nicely the texture of this garment would pop with that color yarn, but I am down to try that out though. And yeah, that's it for the tops. Now, let's get into the accessories and home accessories. So the first accessory I'd like to talk to you about is something I've been quite obsessed with, and that is the flower knot mittens pattern by Laura Moratz. I've talked about the flower knot socks in my fall knitting plans shortly after I found out there's also mittens. I love mittens. It never really gets cold enough here in Belgium to really wear mittens outside, but they're just so cute, and I have purple purple hat and yarn for a purple scarf, and I have some purple yarn that I could use for these mittens. So I've really been dreaming of a purple pair, like a lavender purple pair of flower knot mittens. They sport these thick looking cables because you have like oval chunks where you don't cable, and then small chunks where you cable quite a lot on just a few rows, which kind of ends up looking like the name suggests, like a flower knot. The suggested yarn weight for this pair of mittens is a fingering held with the lace, which should give you a DK weight gauge. I think the pattern suggests several different yarns. I would end up using probably leftovers, like I have some knitting for olive, but I also have like a DK worsted weight yarn that I could use for it. I'll probably be off gauge for that, but it's mittens. I don't really mind if my mittens end up being a bit too big because that's like nice and cozy. I might need to end up knitting them like a little shorter or something, but that doesn't necessarily bother me. You knit it up on 3.5mm needles at a gauge of 28 stitches by 38 rows, and it comes in 2 sizes, and in English and Finnish. The second accessory I want to cover is the asterism socks by Yuka, which is a pattern that actually gives you 2 different patterns in one. They look quite similar, but they're definitely not the same, which I love. They're 2 different argyle patterns. Both socks are knit toe up with gussets. It looks like both of the gussets have a different slip stitch kind of heel, and the argyle also differs for both socks, where one sock has a diamond with just 2 knit stitches, the other one seems to have one with 2 twisted knit stitches, and the one with the twisted stitches is a cross in the middle, whereas the other one is a bit more lacy and dainty. I think anyone who knits up these socks almost has to knit up both of them to get like a lovely little pair. I just recently saw the video by Jessica and Rachel from Those Twins Who Knit, where they talk about all the socks they've knitted before, and I think it was Rachel who had these 2 socks that were both by Sari Nordlund and had like the same lace design but bigger and smaller, and she used a brown yarn and a cream colored yarn, but then on the cream colored pair of socks she had a little brown colored edge in the same color as the brown pair. If you were to knit up these socks, or if I'm knitting up these socks in the future, I would do that for these socks as well. Like I'd give both socks a little edge at the top, like just 2 or 3 rows knit with the color of the other socks. Yeah, that would look just absolutely adorable, I think. And in line with that, I personally go for like a light pink sock and a dark pink sock, or like a light blue sock and a dark blue sock, or like a light gray sock and a dark gray sock. It would just be so aesthetically pleasing and really tickle my brain in just the perfect way. Yeah, if anyone ends up knitting them up like that, send me pictures, please. The yarn weight is of course a fingering weight. Oh, interesting, I forgot to say. So these argyle and braided stitches actually come with video tutorials. So if you're not really too into cables yet, or you haven't knit cables too often and you would like to start off with like something small with a sock, I think this would be a good place to start for complex cables, because I mean, you might notice there's not too many complex cables in this pattern roundup. They kind of scare me to be honest with you. So I think I'm kind of also speaking for myself here, but those video tutorials would be pretty valuable for me, I think, and I think these socks would just be a nice little dipping my toe into the world of very complex cabled and lacy cabled knits, and I think I'd love to try out a sock like that before I like even dare to take on a very complicated cabled or lace sweater. So the yarn weight suggested is of course a fingering sock weight. I would use any sock yarn really, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I would use. She suggests you use 2 or 2.25mm needles to get a stitch gauge of 33 stitches and a row gauge of 48, and the finished foot circumference is supposed to be approximately 17.5 centimeters. Yuka is a Japanese knitwear designer, so the pattern comes in English and Japanese. The next pattern is also a cabled sock, and this is one I've knitted before as a gift knit. These are the I'm Ecstatic socks by Cool Stitches. They're a bit of a less intense cabled knit than the asterism socks would be. They're knit up with a DK weight yarn on 3mm needles, and you just have these all over quite chunky cables, and I think a shadow wrap heel, which don't think I'd do that again. I would replace that heel on this sock by a gusset heel because those fit me better, but the shadow wrap heel is a fun one to knit and it looks really pretty, so if that fits you well and if those wear well for you, would stick with that. The sock is knit top down, and I think I'd probably use Sandnesgarn Perfect, which is one of the only DK weight sock yarns that I know, or maybe like a leftover merino and mohair, because I've heard that the mohair in like a chunky sock like that will help a non-nylon blended merino yarn hold up more nicely over time. The gauge is 22 stitches by 37 rows, and the sock pattern comes in 4 sizes and in English. If I had to choose a color to knit this in, I'd probably do like a bright pink or like a bright blue or green, because I'd probably be wearing those at home all the time, and then if you stick out your feet on the couch and you see your socks, that just tends to make me feel quite joyful, and I think looking out at bright pink cabled socks would make my day or my evening or my afternoon just every single time. Yeah, I think that's what I would do. The last pattern I'd like to talk to you about is a huge endeavor and a home accessory, and that is the Homecoming Blanket by Millie Murphy. And this is essentially an all-over undulating, twisting diamond cable blanket. Now you can knit this in a baby size or in a full-grown huge blanket size, but it's done on 4mm needles, so I think if I would knit this for the first time, I'd probably try it out in the baby size, because I think this is just a monstrosity of a project, but it looks so beautiful that I have been absolutely obsessed with this pattern ever since I came across it for the first time, and I do think I will be knitting it up at some point in my life. Maybe if I've like knit enough sweaters and I don't have room anymore and I don't have inspiration for sweaters or anything, I can like get myself to knit a huge blanket someday, but I'll probably start with like a baby blanket. The interesting thing about this pattern is that the blanket has I-cord edges, but they're like faux I-cord edges, so you don't have to go around the entire blanket and pick up stitches. What you do is you create them with slip stitches on one side and with rolled stockinette on the horizontal sides, which sounds extremely feasible and fun. I love when designers work out beautiful details in ways that are feasible and easy to do for knitters. The suggested yarn is Knit Picks Comfy, and that is a 75% cotton, 25% acrylic blend yarn, and I think indeed for such a big blanket I'll probably go for an acrylic or an acrylic wool or an acrylic cotton blend myself. But yeah, those aren't as fun to knit with as like full-on wools are, so I'm generally a bit harder on my hands and wrists too, so would add to like the low level of feasibility that this would already have for me. Like, I don't know, if I'd ever knit this, it would for sure be a long-term project. Don't know if I've mentioned it yet, but the gauge is 22 stitches by 28 rows, and the language this pattern comes in is English. Now, as I said earlier, I have a Ravelry bundle compiling all of these cabled patterns and more, which I will link in the description box below. I've also linked all of the patterns, so if you want to check those out, you can over there. In the meantime, I would love to hear your thoughts on these patterns and my yarn choices and color choices. Which of these patterns would you knit? Which colors would you pick? Do you agree with my yarn choices or not? Have you knit any of these patterns before, or are you obsessed with any other cabled patterns that I didn't talk about today? I love learning about new patterns and you guys' interests and current whips and everything, so if you feel like sharing, please do down below. I always love when people do that. Also, I'd love if you could give this video a like or subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more of this content, because that would really help me out. And thank you for watching my video and sitting it through all the way to the end. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and get to enjoy some lovely knitting time, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye!